want to know who we're dealing with because that changes your approach to how you communicate with them. It's fairly obvious, right? Don't skip over this. It's good stuff. The other thing priming allows you to do is to start to group information. Okay, you only have so much stuff you can work with in your working memory. So something like this, you might have been counting, right? But that is harder to immediately understand than this, isn't it? Right? You can immediately see that amount. You don't have to think about it. It immediately comes to your mind. The more you can group information, you can form a chunk of information with it. You've just taken this many pieces of information, 10 individual little hash marks, and created it into 2 groups of 5. This is 5 pieces of information to try to work with. This is just 2. It's easier to immediately see, and we can start manipulating it, right? Because we want to learn information so we can think about it, and we can use it to solve problems and be creative with. So one thing that you develop with as you learn skills, as you start to revisit material over and over, you reorganize it in ways that makes it more understandable, right? So it goes from a whole bunch of little words in an abstract to words that are grouped together in certain concepts to even bigger concepts, and your mind is then able to play with more ideas at the same time because you reduce those ideas to representations of deeper ones. Okay? And this is something that occurs throughout learning, but we can initiate just with our warm-up, our priming itself, okay, by just considering the presentation into groups of information. Okay? So we're ready to train or learn, or however you want to think about it, train our learning. The actual, we usually think of it as the work here, the stress of the study or practice. Let's just think about this in training terms. Here's something that's kind of obvious. You might not have thought of that before. What is most effective for studying? We'll just keep it to study here. Just what kinds of things are really good if you're going to learn something? Let's think about just, book learning here, right? Abstract stuff. Let's say you're going to learn, hey, I'm a coach, I don't really have a bio background, I don't really know my anatomy very well. So you decided, I want to learn my anatomy better. Well, here's a subject that has a whole lot of memorization in it, right? And in fact, a lot of the teaching of anatomy is extremely tedious, and a lot of the learning is extremely painful because it degenerates into lists and lists of things, and a whole lot of keeping everything separate and straight in your mind as you learn. And it's a lot of stuff, right? Even if you just start with a skeleton, it's a lot of different facts. What's the best way to learn this? Sully says physically engage with the material.
Hands-on.
Hands-on. So in other words, try to make it have a more actual relevant meaning.
Related to lift.
And Mia says related to lift. These are all very good things. John?
Put in context of what you already know.
Put in context you already know. Exactly. And Becca?
Try to learn the whole thing at once.
Right, find some way to break it up into chunks that are meaningful chunks. All those are all great things. But kind of like Brody in an early lecture, I was looking for something a little bit more basic. Let's think about training. What mistake people do, what main mistake do people make in training progress all the time? And I mean just anyone off the street. What they do is they think that easy is going to work, right? And what we find when you study and when you practice is it's kind of like training. Doing the hard thing gets you the most results, right? So just like training, we find that not only do you need to prep by warming up, but doing the hard work pays off more. I'm going to discuss how a little bit here. What's hard in study? In other words, if you're thinking of study, so you're going to do your actual study itself. Those are your exercises, like if they were in training, right? So the hardness would kind of be like your intensity, right? well, what kinds of things do we do when we study, let's say, your anatomy stuff, right? And what things would be kind of the easy stuff and what stuff would be the hard stuff? It's easy to separate this out by just thinking of things that are going to be easy are the things down here that are passive, and the things that get harder and harder are things that more and more active. Passive stuff is you just listening, you reading. Yeah, it's a starting place for study, right? But what does it do to your ability to learn the first step of learning, which is, getting it in your memory? Let me make a little room, guys. Take this back out. So we're going to study because we want to put this information in our head. We want to know which bone this is, right? So we have memory. What are we trying to do? We're trying to get it. We're all familiar with the term that we're going to try to store it, right? If you look at any memory, but memories have two basic strengths. They all have how strongly they're stored, or storage strength. And that's great that it's somewhere in there, but what's the other aspect? You got to get it back out, right? So the second thing you're going to be looking at is retrieval. Retrieval strength. Okay? So things that you've studied, that you deliberately committed to memory, have a very long, this is again like training, very long, persistent storage strength value. Something you're very familiar with that's been completely committed to memory, right? So not someone you just met in the room, but members of your family, you pretty much know their names, you don't forget them, unless you've had way too much to drink, right? So storage strength is the memory going in, okay? Retrieval strength is how easily you can get back out that information. Once again, you tend to pull up your mom's name pretty quick, right? Especially if you call her mom. It's kind of like cheating. Okay? Someone you just met, I might remember Mia right now, right? But a day later, that name might have slipped from my mind because let's say we just met for the first time, we talked a little bit and yeah, whatever, and it slips away and it's disappears. It may be in there somewhere, right? But I can't pull it back up easily. So when we think about studying being hard or easy for memory that we can store and then later use, the idea is we got to both get it in there and have it accessible to use. And passive learning is pretty bad at making it accessible for use, the retrieval, which ultimately is the more interesting thing. I mean, you got to get it in there, but if you get it in there and you can't get it out, it's completely worthless to you. So things that are more passive tend to be down here. Think about that, though. All the other suggestions for learning that anatomy that we just pulled out of you guys had to do with things that would give it meaning, that would place it into context because of how you're going to use the anatomy. All those things, grouping the information together, were all things that give it more associations and that require that we start using it more actively to begin with. Okay, so if something like this, like reading stuff, is pretty passive, it only gives you a baseline here, we have to reinforce it better. How do you get these things reinforced? How do we increase the strength of these? This will go up with study, this will go up with study, right? Let's say we're just reading it. But how do we get retrieval to go up? Well, it's kind of obvious. Practice using it, right? So one of the strongest things on the other side would be actually testing, right? And things that are similar to this would be you're testing it, reciting it, pulling it up by itself. So while you might read the chapter the first time, let's say it's a chapter on shoulder anatomy. We had that as part of our reading overview, right? Shoulder anatomy. If you sat down right now and just pulled up that talk from Sully again, and just listen to him point out some things on a few slides, you'd be going through it again, reading it, listening and looking at it one more time. That's not the greatest stress compared to just saying, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out my piece of paper here and I'm going to kind of sketch it out and try to remember as much as I can to recall as much information as you can from that learning event. If we had one person rewatch the section and another person try to pull out as much as they could, and we tested them a week from now, who do you think would win? The guy doing the more active, the stronger stress, the harder work. It's kind of exactly what you expect. But what's happened really, if you look at, education's really bad about, really, let's face it, everything's really bad about chasing various fads and things they do over time. But one thing that's really gotten a bad name is this guy right here, testing. Like, testing's a bad thing. Certainly can be bad in certain contexts, but testing is a powerful learning tool. It's one of the most powerful things we have. And this guy here, that's something that's also fallen by the wayside. Kids being forced to learn, oh, it's terrible, multiplication tables. Lots of people don't learn those anymore, right? That's something that has a very, very high storage strength that just pops out like a reflex. If I say 2 times 3, right? Everyone, you don't think, it's just there, right? It just appears as if by magic. That's because it's been drummed into you. It has a very high storage strength. It's also been tested by having to retrieve it many, many times. Completely burned in, it's there. A lot of us, remember when we were kids, we had to learn various poems. And then, same in front of crowds, which, has its own challenges. But learning that material to that level forces you to be able to reproduce it, and that's a much stronger stress than just listening to it again or reading it over. One of the biggest pitfalls with passively going back to information, like, well, I got to study that again, right? So you go back and you reread it or you re-listen to it. Those are pretty much the most passive things you can think of, right? Is that when you look at them, they're familiar to you. Since they're familiar to you, you think, oh, I know it because you recognize it so well. Well, it may be familiar in one sense, but it's not familiar as in you know it, like it's actually memorized. So this also has the pitfall of giving you the illusion of actually having it in your memory and being able to recall it because you recognize it. You guys have all had that experience, I'm sure, where you think you know something because you recognize it. Well, in a lot of cases that's okay because it's something you don't really need to learn or remember. But if it's something that's actually something you intend to master, that's not what you want to do. So the only really way of knowing what you're doing and where you are is actually, if you will, getting into the training environment and going ahead, doing the hard thing. It's hard to sit there with a blank piece of paper and come up with 50 bones, right? It's easier to have a list that you're matching across, right? What's a harder test? Pretty easy to see. This is much more involved. It requires you to generate yourself, and it exposes your weaknesses. Very valuable that way. Now, CJ shouted out some things that are in between that are also very valuable, especially when you're building to the ability to do this kind of thing. And that is you've read some stuff, you've taken some notes. Rewrite those notes. Reorganize them. What are you doing there? Well, you're doing a few things. One, if you've even taken notes the first time, is you've engaged more strongly than just sitting here doing nothing. Not that you're doing nothing, but your brain's just processing in here what I'm saying and what you're seeing, which is different than you hearing it and then going, selecting. Again, when you do notes, what do? You listen, you decide what's the important thing. Okay, this is going to be important, and you just created a cue, again, just like training, a cue that you can use to prime your memory later. Well, don't wait 6 months because this stuff starts to fade away. Rewrite your notes. If something's important, start studying it. And one way to study it is not, again, not just go and read it, but take those notes. So here's your notes. That would be more active. Take your notes, rewrite them. Immediately you'll see, she said something there. I didn't write it down. Let me make a note to myself that that's something I need to fill in. You immediately, just like your test here, testing your knowledge that you can produce, exposes your weaknesses. If you rewrite your notes, or maybe you don't rewrite your notes, maybe we get done talking here, and then later tonight you're talking to somebody and you start talking about these concepts, Again, you're recalling that information, you're reorganizing it, you're processing it again in a different way. It exposes things that you don't know about yet, that aren't part yet of your memory. Now, the really magical part about all this stuff, if you want to think of it that way, is this stuff that's a little bit difficult and more uncomfortable as you go in this direction. It's more work, it's more stress. This is exactly the stuff that will push your ability to retrieve the hardest. In fact, when you take people and you ask them questions, let's say CJ, he writes down several of these things about the shoulder joint, and he knows he's not getting them all. But he sits there and he thinks, and he struggles with it. That struggle, that attempt to retrieve it, is essentially teaching your brain that this is actually very important. So let's say he leaves out some things. He wanted to remember the labrum there, he forgets it. And then he goes back and he reviews the notes that he made and has already rewritten, because he's real motivated to learn this. And he sees labrum there. He spent time, he kind of knows what he was looking for and he couldn't find it, and he fills in that missing piece. That's something that will be burned in even more strongly for the experience of trying, failing. In other words, hitting the wall, stopping, and then going back. It's very easy to talk about this kind of background information, all the model information. It's very easy to think about that as study. What about some of these other things? When we're actually under the bar, it's kind of easy because it's inherently a very stressful event where we learn our motor learning. You know what I'm saying? We don't have to do the easy and hard. If we're actually training, we're studying pretty hard for that type of thing. What about this? Your ability to observe things. What makes that more stressful? Well, it's real time. Yeah, you have the time pressure of coming up with information. That's one of them. So I just want to touch on that. This stuff is most easy to understand in this kind of context. We're all familiar with that from school. But I promise you, many people don't really think about, well, a little bit harder study is actually more effective. They'll do something that uses a bunch of time, like rereading, and really not be getting much out of it. It's very much worth pointing out to people that if you just take it to a little bit different context, you can get a lot more out of the same amount of study time. The second thing that's very important along these lines is a mistake people make, that they shouldn't, because you guys know better, is they think of memory like memory in their computer, right? So your computer or your videotape, it records things that happen. What does your brain do? It's not a videotape, it's not a file system. It doesn't work that way at all, which is good news and bad news. There's good and bad things about that. But we don't just record what happens. We essentially have memories enmeshed in a context of the associations of all the things that we're exposed to. Right? There's a whole bunch of background things going on just staying in this room. There's information that's relevant and less relevant. Right? But it's all tied together in a memory. This is why eyewitness testimony is bad, is because instead of just replaying what happened, the person has to reconstruct what happened. You have to pull it together. And what happens when you take your memory back, when you take your information back out of that web of association, is you're not taking out everything you put in, you're pulling it out, and you're pulling out things that seem relevant. So when to use an accident scene, when you're asked about what happened, you're now focused, before you were driving, so information was coming in, you're driving, you're maybe listening to the radio, that kind of thing's going on in the background. But now, 2 cars smash up in front of you. Okay, now you're like, oh, let me pull out what happened, right? That memory will change, not just from being asked, because you weren't paying attention to those things at the time. Now the cop's asking you, well, what happened? Did you see it? Now you're trying to pay attention, but you're kind of making up as you go along in a sense. In other words, now you weren't really paying attention to this stuff, so you're trying to pull it out of your memory, and there's a whole lot of other stuff in there, right? A week from now, you tell us the story of what happened that day. It won't be the same story. Different things become more or less important to you, which is an important part of learning that we can exploit. And as was mentioned earlier, one of these things is to give it more hooks, to give it more association, to give it a more interesting context, to make it have more value. Rip's example was a good one. Pain tends to assign urgency and value to figuring out and learning these things. Or you have a client who depends on you to learn those things. That's very motivating. This is why learning, context is also a very important thing to do differently. Used to be people tell you to go to, your study room that's like this essentially white room with a clean desk and your book, and have it be perfectly quiet and work in it. What's the problem with that? What does your test room look like? Is it the same context? Now remember, we're not going to just pull this out like, off our hard drive. We have to pull it out of stuff that's all associated within a network. So all those things in the room are cues or not to some of these memories we've learned. Well, what you can do is you can vary the context of your learning, learn in different places. That's helpful also for performance. But you can do very simple things to make a memory more vivid or more interesting, like the pain Rip described. It's more vivid. It's not just, here's the bone's name, here's the muscle's name. It has additional meaning. Now, some people do this automatically because they automatically visualize things. Other people have learned deliberate strategies of maybe learning a list of words or a list of objects. People that do memory competitions will put those objects in various places in the house. So imagine, okay, I have to learn these 20 objects in a certain order. So imagine coming to a place they all already know very well. Remember, something you already know is a big bunch of information and background to put that information in. You walk in the house, there's the umbrella, you go up the stairs. They put things in specific context in their mind. They visualize it extremely vividly and then are then able to recall it by taking the same walk through the house. So one thing you can do when you're trying to learn things is make sure you're giving yourself a lot of cues. Okay? It's, again, a lot like training. One of the common ones you'll see is a mnemonic devices, these horrible, I've always hated them. I have this dislike of them. I deliberately don't ever learn that way. But, you might have this sentence that reminds you the first letter of every sentence is the next, bone that's coming across your finger. And it gives you a way to organize that information, and then you go here, and it reminds you, well, the next one starts with this letter, and you go in that order, and you pull them up very effectively. Okay, so that's also a very commonly used technique to memorize, just a bunch of facts. Right? I don't think it's a very fun way to do it. I prefer visualizing things. It's a very strong way to do it for me and other people who are very visual. Other people will add every other kind of sense to that. Smells are very good at making you remember things. They're actually one of the strongest reminders of various events. You might smell a smell, and it reminds you of a time and a place that you can then remember with such absolute clarity. It's astounding. Okay? So keep this in mind. When you vary the background that you study in or that you practice in, you are now giving that same information. Like you might go through it in the same exact way with a different background. Now it's associated with more information, and it will make it easier to actually embed and learn that information. In the gym, sometimes you get people that are very set on doing things in a very exact way, which has some value with consistency, but it's usually not very helpful once they go to a meet, right? Because now, the thing isn't aligned like this, they don't have that object to look at, things are different, and those distractions can actually hinder things. You can consider that they've learned in such a constrained way, they can't remember it. They can't remember what to do. So in a lot of ways, it's actually very useful to vary things because it allows you to learn it in a different web of associations and outside of that context. Okay, so now your performance ability is better. For you guys to perform, that's actually a very important thing to do. I think everyone that's had to do that kind of thing in public, whether it's, presenting a case or dancing or playing an instrument, you really learn you have to be able to do it anywhere.